The air in the old residential building, known as Building 63, was thick, heavy with decades of dust and silenced memories. Located in a historic neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York, the building was a relic from the 1920s. With its reddish brick facade and wrought iron adornments, that time had rusted. Every autumn, when the cold wind from New York Bay blew between its floors, the building seemed to groan, a lament that blended with the distant hum of the city. Somewhere deep within its metallic entrails, an elevator creaked, the hollow, unsettling sound filling the void. Jonas, an elevator maintenance technician with a decade of experience in the megalopolis, stepped into the cabin. The smell of lubricating oil mingled with the characteristic mustiness of old buildings. The door closed with a heavy hiss, and the flickering light inside, from a fluorescent bulb that intermittently failed, intensified the feeling of claustrophobia. The stained mirror at the back of the cabin reflected Jonas's distorted image, his face tired but alert. He pressed the button for the top floor, a floor that housed only the elevator machinery and offered a stunning, though today cloudy, view of the Manhattan skyline. Suddenly, a tremor. It wasn't the usual sway of the elevator as it began its ascent. This was different, deep, a vibration that seemed to come from the very foundations of the earth. The metal groaned, cracked, a sharp sound that pierced Jonas's ears. The cabin swayed violently, and the lights flickered before going out completely, plunging Jonas into total darkness, except for a sliver of light coming from the top of the door, like a peeking eye. Then, the vision. It wasn't a memory or a dream, but a terrifying reality unfolding before his eyes, as vivid as life, but without sound. The ground. Not a floor, but a hole. An abyss that swallowed everything. Crumbling concrete, twisted steel, windows shattering into 1,000 fragments. He saw the building collapse from top to bottom in seconds, like a house of cards. Dozens of faces, horrified, contorted in terror, soundless, sinking into the darkness, swallowed by dust and rubble. Jonas recognized them. Mr. Goldberg, the grumpy ground floor superintendent, the young Patel family from the 5th floor, the solitary Mrs. Henderson from the 9th. All of them, swallowed by the void. Their faces a silent scream that echoed in Jonas's mind. A silent scream echoed in Jonas's chest, freezing his blood. The smell of twisted metal and ancient dust filled his nostrils, an acrid odor of destruction that seemed to permeate the very air of the cabin. The cold of terror pierced his skin, a chilling shiver that didn't come from the air conditioning, but from the awareness of impending death. He was there, witnessing a collapse that hadn't happened yet, but was mere seconds away from becoming a brutal reality. The distant sound of sirens, which he would only hear hours later, already seemed to resonate in his ears, an omen of disaster. He had to act. The scream finally tore from Jonas's throat. It wasn't a cry of panic, but of desperation and conviction. The vision of Building 63 disintegrating into dust, taking dozens of innocent lives with it, was seared into his mind. The smell of dust and twisted metal, the sound of concrete cracking, the sensation of freefall, everything was terrifyingly real, even though it hadn't happened yet. The light in the elevator had started flickering again, an intermittence that seemed to mock his anguish. He threw himself against the elevator control panel, his fingers trembling as he dialed the New York Fire Department's emergency number. His heart pounded against his ribs, a frantic drum. The voice of the dispatcher on the other end seemed distant, muffled by the hum of the Premonition still echoing in his ears, blending with the elevator's wiring buzz. "Gas alert!" He shouted, forcing his voice to sound as convincing as possible, almost as if he were acting for his own life. "There's a strong gas smell at Building 63, 127 Elm Street, Brooklyn. You need to evacuate immediately." "It's strong, very strong." The lie, however painful, was necessary. Time was critical. He knew no one would believe a premonition. The bureaucracy, the paperwork, the endless questions, there was no time for that. He needed everyone out. The plan was risky, but the alternative was mass death. He felt dirty for lying, but the vision of the children and elderly he had seen collapse outweighed any guilt. Within minutes, sirens tore through the gray air of a Brooklyn autumn morning. The cold wind, carrying the salty scent of the Atlantic, intensified the urgency. Fire trucks, ambulances, and police cars converged on Building 63. Elm Street, usually bustling with morning traffic and the hum of cafes, was quickly cordoned off, and the sidewalks soon filled with curious onlookers. Residents, initially confused and annoyed by the false alarm that pulled them from their homes in the morning, began evacuating the building under the watchful supervision of firefighters. Jonas, his heart pounding, blended into the crowd. He watched every face that emerged, every expression, every gesture. Parents carrying sleepy children bundled in blankets. Elderly people complaining about the cold and inconvenience. Young professionals rushing to work, checking their phones impatiently, all of them, unknowingly, were being pulled from the clutches of a cruel fate. He felt a pang of relief for each person who walked through the door, a small victory against the shadow that had hung over the building. There was still the smell of dampness and mold that Jonas always associated with old buildings. But now, under the dull morning light that barely pierced the leaden clouds, he noticed something more. A subtle aroma of old cement and lime, mixed with an almost imperceptible metallic odor, as if the building's structure was bleeding. His eyes scanned the building's facade, searching for what he knew he would find, what the premonition had shown him with brutal clarity. It didn't take long. On the third floor, a thin crack, like a spiderweb thread, snaked across the brick wall, almost invisible to a less trained eye. On the sixth, another, wider, looked like a tear in the building's skin, a sign that its integrity was compromised. And at the top, where the skyscrapers seemed to touch New York's cloudy sky, the vision of his premonition seemed to materialize. The cracks now more evident, like open wounds on the structure that would soon give way. The structure looked like an exposed skeleton, revealing its fragility. Dr. Elias Thorne, a renowned structural engineer with a grizzled beard and penetrating blue eyes, was one of the first to arrive. His reputation was impeccable, and his gaze, though serious, was always analytical, seeking the truths hidden in physics and engineering. As he inspected the cracks, his expression grew grim. He ran his fingers over the fissures, his brow furrowed in concentration, murmuring inaudible calculations. Lena Petrova, an investigative journalist with a curious gaze and a camera hanging around her neck, approached, taking photos and asking questions with almost feline agility. She was known for her persistence, and Jonas knew that, sooner or later, she would come after him, driven by her journalistic intuition. "It's worse than I thought," Dr. Thorne mumbled to a firefighter, his voice grave and heavy, like the very foundations he studied. The foundations. There's serious structural compromise. This building might not last much longer. The confirmation, coming from such a respected expert, sent a chill down Jonas's spine. He had saved those people. He had cheated death. For now. The relief, however, was fleeting. The premonition wasn't just about the building's collapse. It was about the lives lost. And he knew, deep in his soul, that fate would not be so easily fooled. The game, he realized with a shiver that chilled his stomach, was just beginning. He could feel the presence of something dark in the air, a presence that would not be easily dismissed. The news of Building 63's miraculous escape spread like wildfire through the city, fueled by the insatiable curiosity of the New York press. Jonas, the hero who called in the false gas alarm, became the center of attention, a strange and mysterious figure who refused to appear on newscasts. He avoided the press, the spotlights, the incessant questions. The sound of sirens still echoed in his ears. A disturbing soundtrack and the smell of twisted metal seemed to permeate his clothes. Even after countless washes, a constant reminder of the horror he had witnessed and prevented. With every news report he saw, every time his name was mentioned in articles, a pang of anxiety pierced him like a cold needle. He knew that fate, or whatever was behind that premonition, would not so easily give up its victims. The first death to hit him was that of Mrs. Henderson, an elderly lady, in her 80s, with silver hair always neatly tied in a delicate bun and a gentle smile, always offering homemade cookies to the building staff, the aroma of cinnamon and sugar still lingering in his memory. She had survived the imminent collapse, evacuating Building 63 with the help of firefighters, visibly shaken but grateful. Days later, the news came through a colleague of Jonas, a whispered rumor in a maintenance hallway. Mrs. Henderson, while preparing her favorite soup in her temporary apartment in Queens, a soup whose smell of fresh vegetables he could almost sense, had slipped in the kitchen, hitting her head and dying instantly. A trivial death, a common household accident, the forensics concluded. But for Jonas, there was nothing common about it. Mrs. Henderson was in the premonition. Her face, one of the many falling into the void, was clear in his memory, haunting his thoughts. A day later, it was Mark Jensen's turn, a young and ambitious real estate agent who lived in Building 63. He had vehemently complained about the evacuation, missing an important meeting due to the false alarm, his irritated voice still echoing in Jonas's mind. He was found in his temporary apartment in Soho, a victim of fulminant food poisoning. The food? A plate of fresh oysters he had bought from a street vendor, the salty, metallic smell of oysters seeming to hover over Jonas, nauseating him. Again, an accident, a misfortune. But Mark Jensen was also in the premonition. His face, contorted in horror, was there, vivid and terrifying. Jonas felt the net tightening, the walls of his private world seemingly closing in. He tried to rationalize, to convince himself that they were just macabre coincidences, the human mind looking for patterns where none existed. But the knot in his stomach tightened with each death notice, with each funeral he secretly attended from afar, hidden in the crowd, feeling the weight of guilt. He started seeing Building 63 residents everywhere, in the coffee line where he tried to hide, on the noisy subway, on the bustling New York street. Every face he recognized from his premonition was a trigger for anxiety, a dark reminder. He watched them with a mix of hope and terror, trying to predict fate's next move, like a desperate player in a deadly chess game. The metallic, bitter smell of anxiety seemed to permeate his own skin. Dr. Elias Thorne, meanwhile, was immersed in his own studies. The cracks in Building 63, now undergoing controlled demolition, were an intriguing puzzle for him. He spent hours in his office at Columbia University, surrounded by architectural plans, soil reports, and dusty books, trying to understand the underlying cause of the structural failure. He began to notice a pattern, an anomaly in his analyses. A strange, almost imperceptible vibration, which seemed to emanate from the ground beneath the building. He suspected a geological fault, an unknown fault line. But there was something more, something he couldn't quantify. A feeling that the earth was alive, breathing a cold, ancient breath. The smell of old paper and strong coffee filled his office, an ironic contrast to the inexplicable nature of his discoveries. Lena Petrova, the journalist, hadn't given up on Jonas. Her nose for untold stories was almost supernatural. She approached him at a bustling Greenwich Village cafe. The smell of espresso and fresh newspapers in the air, a contrast to the heavy atmosphere surrounding Jonas. The murmur of conversations and the clinking of ceramic cups were an ironic backdrop to the tension building between them. "Mr. Jonas," she began, her voice soft yet persistent, like the drip of water that wears down stone. "I'm Lena Petrova from the New York Chronicle. I'd like to talk about Building 63, about what really happened there." Jonas shrugged, trying to appear indifferent, a fragile facade he knew wouldn't fool her. There's not much to say. "I smelled gas. I called the firefighters. End of story." He tried to keep his gaze fixed on his coffee cup, but he felt her eyes burning into his skin. Lena chuckled softly, a dry, humorless sound. "Is your sense of smell so good that you can predict the future, Mr. Jonas?" Because, oddly enough, the people who were in Building 63, the very ones you saved, are dying. Not in spectacular accidents, like a building falling, but in bizarre coincidences. Too many coincidences for my taste. She paused, letting her words hang in the air. It's as if fate is collecting what was denied it, isn't it? Lena's words were like knives, each one sinking deeper into his conviction. She knew, or at the very least, she suspected deeply. The air in the cafe seemed to thin. The hum of conversations turned into a distant, ominous buzz. The smell of coffee mingled with the imaginary scent of despair that Jonas felt in his own body. He looked at Lena, his eyes conveying a mix of fear and helplessness. He could no longer deny what was happening. Fate was collecting its price, and he was merely a pawn in a much larger, darker game. He could feel the invisible presence that was hunting him, getting closer and closer. Jonas couldn't sleep anymore. Every time he closed his eyes, the faces from the Premonition materialized in the dark, accompanied by the phantom sound of cracking concrete. His days were a succession of apprehensions, his eyes scanning every familiar face, searching for fate's next targets, as if he could predict the next move of a piece on a macabre chessboard. The news of Mrs. Henderson's and Mark Jensen's deaths kept echoing in his mind, a somber chorus of lost voices. He tried to find patterns, connections, anything that could predict the next move. Was fate choosing the oldest, the youngest, the richest? The questions haunted him, unanswered, intensifying his sense of powerlessness. The metallic, bitter smell of anxiety seemed to permeate his own skin. The third death came in the form of an electric shock. Michael Chun, a software programmer who lived on Building 63's 10th floor, and who had been involved in one of the apartment disputes due to the evacuation, his shrill voice still echoing in Jonas's memory, was found in his temporary apartment in Brooklyn, electrocuted by a faulty cell phone charger. The forensics concluded it was an unfortunate accident, a generic, low-quality charger, a trivial fatality. But Jonas knew. Michael Chun was also in his premonition, his pale, shocked face etched into his memory. Cold sweat trickled down his back, even on a mild autumn day. The metallic smell of burnt electricity, which he had felt in the premonition, seemed to linger in the air around him, an eerie reminder of what had happened. With each death, the web of coincidences tightened around Jonas. He began to feel like a rat in a labyrinth, desperately running from one trap to another, knowing that the puzzle was being assembled and he was the final piece. He avoided elevators, preferring the stairs, even if it meant climbing dozens of flights in tall Manhattan buildings, his muscles aching, but his mind a little calmer for being in control of his steps. He avoided restaurants, terrified of food poisoning or choking, each bite a potential risk. He bought his own food and cooked at home, with a paranoid vigilance over every ingredient. The smell of fresh food mixed with the smell of his own anxiety. The noise of New York City seemed like a distant chorus of potential dangers. Every horn, every siren, a constant reminder of his vulnerability. While Jonas plunged into his own private hell, Lena Petrova continued her investigation. She had an unusual nose for untold stories, and the sequence of deaths of former Building 63 residents fascinated and intrigued her, fueling her tireless search for the truth. She visited Mrs. Henderson's family, who spoke of the lady's kindness and the strange coincidence of her death, their voices choked with sadness. She interviewed Mark Jensen's colleagues, who mourned the loss of a bright future and the unfortunate bad luck with oysters, an ironic fate for such an ambitious man. She went to Michael Chun's apartment, smelling the lingering burnt odor, and heard his family's disbelief about a simple accident, which they couldn't accept. Lena noticed Jonas's distant look. His eyes, once perceptive, now carried the weight of an unbearable secret. She felt that he knew something deeper than he was willing to admit. She began following Jonas, discreetly, with the skill of a shadow, observing his movements, his habits, his reactions, the scent of her own curiosity in every step. She saw him on the subway, his gaze sweeping over every face, his body tense, almost hunched. She saw him in a coffee shop, refusing a slice of cake the barista offered, his distrust almost palpable, as if he feared every bite could be his last. She saw him avoid a construction site, veering off his path to avoid walking under scaffolding, a clear sign of his growing paranoia. Lena's observations began to connect to her own research. She was investigating a series of New York urban legends, stories of misfortune and curses linked to old buildings, a dark subgenre of the city's history. She had found references to an ancient earth sacrifice ritual, practiced by a forgotten sect to feed the foundations of large constructions, ensuring their longevity through a dark pact with the soil. Building 66, she discovered, had been built over an ancient indigenous burial ground, a sacred land whose ancestral energies had been disturbed. The air in the city library, where she spent hours researching, was stuffy and dusty, but the smell of aged paper and old ink was a comfort amidst the darkness of her discoveries. At the same time, Dr. Elias Thorne was obsessed with the underground vibration he had detected at the Building 63 site. He had installed high-precision seismic sensors in the area, and the results were unsettling. The vibration wasn't natural. It didn't follow known geological fault patterns. It was rhythmic, almost like a slow, heavy heartbeat emanating from deep within the earth, a dark pulse. He had ruled out known geological faults, but the more he studied, the more science seemed to fail in explaining the phenomenon. The only explanation, however absurd it seemed, was that something was moving down there, something he couldn't identify, but whose presence he felt. He found himself consulting ancient geological texts, maps of forgotten faults, and even folkloric legends about earth spirits in indigenous cultures, an area he would have previously dismissed as mere superstition. He felt a chill down his spine, a sense that he was on the verge of a discovery that would challenge all his scientific understanding of the world. On a rainy New York night, the monotonous sound of rain beating against his apartment window was Jonas's only company. A sound that once calmed him now seemed like a death drum. He was watching the news, an untouched glass of water in his hand, his appetite gone. The reporter announced the death of Emily Carter, a young artist who lived on Building 63's fourth floor. Cause of death: hit by a runaway taxi in Times Square, the sound of the accident echoing in his mind. The taxi, police said, had brake failure, yet another coincidence. Jonas closed his eyes. Emily Carter. Her panicked face was in his premonition. The vision of Emily's lifeless body, crushed under the taxi's wheels, was vivid in his mind, accompanied by the smell of burnt rubber and wet asphalt. He felt the cold street wind hitting his face, the city's dampness and grime. Fate wasn't just killing people. It was mocking him, using trivial accidents to fulfill its premonition, dancing around his attempts at salvation. He was running against a ghost, and the ghost was always one step ahead, each death a cruel whisper. The suspense grew, each lost life a reminder of his failure to cheat death. He was a marked man, and the world was his trap. Jonas knew he couldn't run anymore. The deaths piled up like a mound of dry leaves, and paranoia consumed him, turning every shadow into a threat, every sound into an omen. He needed help, even if it meant breaking his silence and exposing the truth, however unbelievable. His mind, a tangled mess of fears and loose clues, led him to Lena Petrova. She was skeptical, yes, but she was also intelligent. And more importantly, she already suspected something supernatural, a truth hiding in the cracks of reality. The smell of old paper and ink, which he had associated with the library where Lena researched, now seemed to blend with the smell of fear that hung over him, a sharp and persistent odor. He found her at the entrance of an old building in Lower Manhattan, a labyrinth of stairs and hallways that smelled of dampness and stale coffee, where Lena kept a small office. The dim light from the streetlights, filtered by the cold mist rising from the East River, illuminated her face, which revealed a mix of tiredness and insatiable curiosity. The distant traffic sounds and the city's hum seemed amplified by the silence of their own anxieties, a background score to the unfolding drama. "I know why you're here, Mr. Jonas," Lena said, her voice almost a whisper, as if she feared the walls had ears. "The deaths. They're not accidents, are they?" Her eyes, which seemed to see right through him, held him captive. Jonas shook his head, his eyes fixed on hers, his throat dry. "No, they're not. I saw it. In the elevator. I saw the building collapse. I saw people dying. I saw all of them. The same people who are dying now." He poured out the story, words gushing out like an uncontrollable torrent, laden with years of repressed terror. The vivid premonition, the smell of dust and twisted metal, the horrified faces of his neighbors, the false gas alarm, the hurried evacuation, the sigh of relief that had been so fleeting. And then the chained deaths, each one an echo of the original vision, an endless torture. Cold sweat trickled down his temples as he described every detail, reliving the horror with each word. Lena listened intently, her expression gradually shifting from skepticism to a grim fascination. She didn't interrupt, her eyes fixed on him, absorbing every word, every nuance of his trembling voice. When he finished, a heavy silence filled the air, broken only by the cold New York wind, whistling through the window cracks and the distant sound of a siren. "I believe you, Jonas," she said, her voice firm and filled with newfound conviction. "Or, at least, I want to believe you. What you described fits something I've been investigating. Urban legends, ancient rituals, buildings built on sacred ground." Lena then shared her own discoveries, her voice gaining strength as she revealed the results of her relentless research. References to a forgotten ancient cult that believed in a soul devourer that fed on large-scale sacrifices to maintain its existence, and Building 63's strange connection to an indigenous burial ground. She spoke of the underground vibration Dr. Thorne had detected, and how it could be linked to the site's ancestral energy, a link between the physical and spiritual worlds. The smell of old books and strong coffee permeated the room, creating an atmosphere of mystery and forbidden knowledge. "And Dr. Thorne, he's involved in this somehow too," Lena continued, her voice lower, almost conspiratorial. "He's obsessed with this vibration. I saw him today, almost like a ghost, at the old Building 63 site, with his equipment. His eyes fixed on the ground, a man of science confronted with the inexplicable. He doesn't talk about it openly, but I feel he's getting close to something big and terrifying." Jonas felt a shiver run down his spine, a coldness that didn't come from the environment, but from growing comprehension. The missing piece of the puzzle was falling into place. Dr. Thorne, with his scientific and analytical mind, was validating the clues Lena had discovered through folklore and hidden history. They decided to confront Dr. Thorne. They found him in his office at Columbia University, a space crammed with books, maps, and measuring equipment. The smell of old books and fresh coffee, which Dr. Thorne obsessively brewed, filled the air. A comforting fragrance that contrasted with the gravity of the situation. Dr. Thorne, initially reluctant to share his more bizarre discoveries, yielded to Lena's persistence and Jonas's palpable desperation. His gray eyes, usually so controlled, now reflected a mix of fascination and fear. He showed them the seismic graphs, the rhythmic patterns that couldn't be explained by natural phenomena, the heartbeats of the earth. "It's like a pulse," Dr. Thorne murmured, his voice distant, almost hypnotized, his fingers tracing the graph lines. A pulse emanating from beneath Building 63. I found references in ancient texts to an entity, a force that feeds on the energy of death. And this site, this indigenous burial ground, was considered a portal to the other side, a place of transition and power. Dr. Thorne revealed that the ancient inhabitants of that land believed that when a large number of people died in a sacred place, their souls could be trapped and used to nourish an entity, a devourer that manifested through tragic events and unexpected deaths, a cycle of horror and sustenance. The collapse of Building 63 would have been a mass sacrifice, a feast for this entity. Jonas, by evacuating the building, had stolen the creature's meal, disrupting its feeding cycle. "It's collecting," Jonas whispered, his voice choked with dread, the final understanding settling in his mind. "It's collecting the lives I saved." One by one. Dr. Thorne nodded slowly, his eyes filled with sad comprehension. The energy was interrupted. Now it seeks compensation. And you, Jonas, by preventing the collapse, you became the center of its attention, the key to its revenge, the main course. The revelation was devastating. Jonas wasn't just running from fate. He was being hunted by an ancient, hungry entity, a creature he had accidentally challenged. The fear that consumed him was now a primordial terror, a fear of something ancient and unfathomable. He had saved dozens of lives, but now his own life was at stake. And death seemed to approach, not from a spectacular collapse, but from a series of banal accidents he couldn't predict, invisible traps. The fight against fate had turned into a dark hunt, and he was the prey, the air in his lungs seemingly thinning. The air in the room felt heavy, almost suffocating, laden with the weight of revelations and the persistent smell of old books and forgotten mysteries. Dr. Thorne's revelation transformed Jonas's premonition into an even more terrifying reality. He wasn't just dodging fate. He was being hunted by an ancient, hungry entity. The feeling of being under constant observation intensified, every cell in his body on high alert. Every shadow seemed to harbor a hidden danger, every distant sound an omen of his own death. The cold of fear penetrated his bones, a cold that didn't come from the New York weather, but from an invisible presence. The smell of damp, decaying earth, like that of a freshly dug grave, seemed to follow him, permeating his clothes and skin, even within the apparent safety of his apartment. Jonas, Lena, and Dr. Thorne formed an unlikely alliance, bound by terror and the search for answers. While Jonas tried to stay one step ahead of death, Lena and Dr. Thorne investigated ways to stop the entity, becoming hunters of a dangerous truth. Lena delved even deeper into ancient texts and rituals, spending days in dusty libraries, seeking a way to break the link between the entity and the souls it sought, her fingers gliding over yellowed pages. Dr. Thorne, meanwhile, analyzed seismic patterns, his high-tech equipment seeming small and insignificant before the force they measured, trying to predict where the entity's energy would manifest next, where the next coincidental accident would occur. The air in their research spaces was thick, laden with a mix of strong coffee and the smell of old paper, a smell that, to them, signified the search for salvation. The entity, however, was cunning, cruel in its creativity. Its traps were not grand or supernatural. They weren't falling lightning bolts or spectacular collapses. They were banal and insidious, disguised as everyday accidents, a cruel mockery. It was as if death was laughing, playing with Jonas, using the most common details of daily life to reach him, like a predator toying with its prey. Jonas began to avoid anything that could be a trap. He no longer rode the subway, fearing a derailment or an accident on the crowded platforms. He walked for miles, even under New York's scorching sun or the cold autumn rain, his feet aching, but his mind a little calmer for being in control of his steps. He avoided restaurants, terrified of food poisoning or choking, every bite a potential risk. He bought his own food and cooked at home, with a paranoid vigilance over every ingredient. The smell of fresh food mixed with the smell of his own anxiety. The noise of New York City seemed like a distant chorus of potential dangers. Every honk, every siren, a constant reminder of his vulnerability. One day, while walking down a busy midtown street, where skyscrapers seemed to lean over him, Jonas saw a Building 63 resident, a young man named Alex, hurrying across the street. At that very moment, a runaway bus sped around the corner, its brakes screeching in a piercing sound that cut through the air. Jonas felt panic freeze his blood. He had seen Alex in the Premonition, his face distorted by terror, crushed under the wheels. Acting on instinct, before he even thought, Jonas shoved Alex out of the way with desperate force. The bus narrowly missed him, the hot, dirty exhaust air on his face, the smell of burning diesel in his nostrils. Alex, dazed, got up and thanked him, unaware of the extent of the danger he had just avoided. Not realizing Jonas had interposed himself between him and death. Jonas, however, knew. He had saved Alex from the bus, but fate, he realized with a shiver that made him tremble, would find another way, a more subtle and cruel one. Hours later, the news came via a flash on his cell phone screen. Alex had died in his temporary apartment, a dozen blocks away. Cause of death: a potted plant falling from a window on the floor above, a trivial household accident. A bizarre coincidence, the news reported. Jonas felt despair deepen, like a bottomless pit. He was trying to cheat fate, but fate was relentless and creative, an adversary that always found a new path. The smell of withered flowers, associated with the potted plant, seemed to linger in the air around him, a grim reminder of the inevitability of the death he tried to avoid. Lena and Dr. Thorne, meanwhile, discovered something terrifying about the entity. It was fed by a cycle of fear and despair, generated by the deaths. The more people died, and the more Jonas tried to avoid them, the stronger the entity became, its power growing with each soul consumed. The only way to stop it, according to ancient texts, was to break the cycle, denying it the energy of its victims, cutting off its source of sustenance. But how? How to deny something so voracious? The sacrifices were made to anchor the entity, Dr. Thorne explained, his hands tracing an ancient map of the indigenous burial ground beneath Building 63, the parchment dusty and fragile. It's linked to this land, to this place. If we can somehow release the trapped energy, perhaps we can break the cycle, undoing the pact that bound it here. Lena found an ancient prayer of purification, a ritual that, according to the texts, could dissipate malevolent energies linked to the earth, a forgotten but powerful chant. Dr. Thorne, despite his scientific skepticism, was desperate and agreed to help locate the exact point from which the vibration emanated. The entity sought, the knot that needed to be untied. The air in his laboratory, smelling of chemicals and electronic equipment, was tense, charged with anticipation. The tension increased with each passing minute, each breath. Jonas felt the entity's presence around him, a coldness that wasn't from the New York winter, but something older and darker, an aura of death. He knew the entity's next move would be against him. The hunt was coming to an end, and he was the final prey, the main target. The bitter taste of fear filled his mouth, a metallic taste of dread. The trap, he realized, wouldn't just be an object or isolated event. It would be something more insidious, something he couldn't predict, because it would come from within himself, a trap forged by fate itself. Night fell over New York, the sky stained a sickly orange by the illuminated skyscrapers. Jonas, Lena, and Dr. Thorne stood at the epicenter of the old Building 63 site, now a barren lot filled with rubble. The wind howled, carrying the smell of dust and concrete. Dr. Thorne, with his equipment, pointed to a specific spot on the ground where the vibration was most intense. Lena, her eyes fixed on an ancient scroll, began to recite the prayer of purification in a forgotten language. Jonas felt the energy in the air. It wasn't just a cold wind, but a presence, an oppressive weight that made his bones ache. He knew the entity was there, furious, fighting against the ritual that threatened its existence. He could feel its rage, its hunger. He was there, the final sacrifice the entity sought. As Lena recited, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. It wasn't a natural earthquake, but a visceral convulsion, as if the earth itself was writhing in pain. Fine cracks appeared in the concrete, snaking towards Jonas. Dr. Thorne cried out, trying to protect him, but it was useless. Fate, or the entity, was collecting its price. Suddenly, a snap. It didn't come from the ground, nor the air. It came from inside Jonas, a dry snap like a bone breaking. He looked down. Nothing. But the sensation was unmistakable. He felt weak, as if something had been torn from him. The terror that had accompanied him for days gave way to a strange sense of peace, as if the weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders.